he is standing in front of cameras again. That part never changes. But this time, there is no costume, no character to hide behind, no punchline waiting at the end of the sentence. Danny DeVito is 81 years old, and he is saying something he has never said quite this plainly before. That the woman he lost, the woman he hurt, the woman he left, the woman who left him, was the only love of his life. Not one of them, the only one. 30 years of marriage, a separation that shredded both of them, years of silence and distance and regret. And now, at the far end of everything, he is standing in the wreckage of it and calling it love. The question is not whether he means it, the question is what it cost her to be it. Most people think they already know this story. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman, Hollywood's unlikely power couple. Short, brash, funny, real. The kind of pair that late-night hosts used as shorthand for proof that love could survive the industry's grinding machinery. 30 years together, 3 children, a marriage that outlasted almost every other union in their generation of actors. People loved the idea of them so completely that they stopped looking at the reality underneath it. But here is what almost nobody talks about. They separated, quietly, painfully, repeatedly. And every time the relationship fractured, the story got smoothed over by the same mythology that had always protected it. The narrative of the enduring couple was so powerful, so useful to both of their public images, that the actual suffering happening inside it rarely made the front page. That is where this story really lives, not in the highlight reel, in the gaps. To understand what Rhea Perlman actually signed up for, you have to understand what Danny DeVito was before she found him. Not the movie star, not the icon, the man underneath the celebrity. What he needed, what he feared, what he had trained himself to become long before any camera was pointed at him. Daniel Michael DeVito Jr. was born on November 17, 1944 in Neptune Township, New Jersey. He was the youngest of 3 children, raised in a working-class Italian-American family that moved to Asbury Park when he was a child. He was short, he knew it early, and he knew what it meant in the specific social arithmetic of American boyhood. He was not the kid who got handed things, he was the kid who had to figure out how to take the room another way. What a child learns in that position is not always what adults imagine. People assume that growing up as the funny one, the scrappy one, the one who wins with personality instead of presence, teaches humility. It rarely does. What it actually teaches is strategy. It teaches you that charm is a tool, that making people laugh is a form of control, that if you can get the room on your side before anyone has a chance to underestimate you, you have already won. Danny learned this lesson thoroughly. He was enrolled at the Wilfrid Academy of Hair and Beauty Culture, not for ambition, but because his sister worked there and the family needed practical options. But something shifted. Somewhere in that sideways path, he found his way to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, and what he found there would change everything. He found that he could inhabit other people, that on a stage, the rules were different, that a man who stood 5 feet tall could fill a room in ways that nobody could dismiss. He also found Rhea Perlman. She was a student, not yet famous, not yet Carla Tortelli, not yet the woman whose voice would become one of the most recognizable sounds on American television. She was young and sharp and saw something in him that he may not have fully seen in himself yet. According to accounts of their early relationship, it was immediate and consuming. They moved in together within weeks of meeting. This was 1971. Neither of them had anything resembling a career yet. What they had was each other and the shared ferocity of 2 people who intended to become something. Stop here for a moment, because this is where the story's deepest wound is planted, even if it takes decades to open. When 2 people build themselves up together from nothing, the relationship becomes fused with the ambition. The love and the survival instinct become the same thing. That can be profoundly bonding. It can also be quietly dangerous. Because when one person's career accelerates beyond the others, when one name starts appearing in larger letters on larger screens, the original equality that held everything together begins to shift. Not always visibly, not always consciously, but it shifts. In the early years, the imbalance ran the other direction. Rhea Perlman actually landed major work before Danny did. She began appearing in television and off-Broadway productions while he was still struggling to find consistent work. She was the one with the momentum. She was, by some measures, the one holding the partnership together financially and professionally while he kept pushing against the industry's resistance to what he was. That detail matters more than most retellings acknowledge. The breakthrough came through a relationship that would define Danny DeVito's public image more than anything else in his career. He was cast in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, playing Martini in Milos Forman's adaptation of Ken Kesey's novel. The film swept the Academy Awards. It made Jack Nicholson a legend and gave Danny DeVito his first real foothold in American audiences. But it was television that made him a star. Taxi premiered in 1978 on ABC, and with it came Louis De Palma, the dispatcher who became one of the most indelible characters in the history of American sitcoms. Louis was small and mean and brilliant and pitiable and funny in a way that cut. He was the bully who was also the victim. He was the man who had been told he was less than and had decided to make everyone else feel it first. He was, in many ways, a grotesque and comedic amplification of something real. What the audience loved about Louis De Palma was his refusal to apologize for taking up space. What they missed was that the character's core wound, the wound of a man who believed desire was something you grabbed rather than something you were given, was not entirely fictional. Taxi ran from 1978 to 1983. During those years, Danny DeVito became famous. Really famous. The kind of famous that changes how people treat you, how you move through rooms, what you are offered, and what you are forgiven. And Rhea Perlman was becoming famous too. Cheers premiered in 1982, and her performance as Carla Tortelli would eventually earn her 4 Emmy Awards. On the surface, they were a perfect Hollywood story. 2 actors who met before either was anyone, who supported each other through the grind of rejection and obscurity, who then rose together and made it and stayed together despite every pressure the industry could apply. They married in 1982, after 11 years together, after the careers had taken shape, after the question of who they were to each other had been answered, or so it seemed. What almost nobody saw coming was that marriage would do something to them that 11 years of living together had not. Here is the detail that gets lost in the warm mythology. For over a decade, Danny and Rhea had chosen each other without a legal contract binding them to that choice. Every morning was a voluntary decision. That kind of relationship has its own particular intimacy. It says, "I am here because I want to be here, not because a document says I must be." Marriage changed the architecture of that. Not necessarily in the ways either of them would have been able to articulate, but the relationship that had been fluid, urgent, and driven by shared hunger began to settle into something more institutional. And around the same time, Danny's career was entering its most explosive phase. The 1980s and 1990s were, professionally, his golden era. Romancing the Stone, Ruthless People, Throw Mama from the Train, which he also directed, Twins, Batman Returns, where his Penguin remains one of the most disturbing villain performances in the history of comic book cinema, Get Shorty, L.A. Confidential. Movies that proved he was not a novelty or a supporting presence, but a genuine cinematic force. Fame at that level does not just expand a career, it expands a person's sense of their own permission. Let's be precise about what is documented and what is not, because this story deserves accuracy rather than gossip. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman separated for the first time in 2012 after 30 years of marriage. The separation was confirmed publicly. It was described in the careful language both of them used as mutual and amicable. They maintained that they remained close, that they co-parented their 3 children, Lucy, Grace, and Jake, with genuine cooperation and warmth. Then, in 2013, reports emerged that they had reconciled. Then, in 2017, they separated again. That pattern, the leaving and the returning, the rupture and the repair, is not a tabloid footnote. It is the emotional center of this entire story. Because what it reveals is that these two people could not fully be together and could not fully be without each other. The relationship had become something more complicated than love and less simple than damage. Rhea Perlman, in the rare moments she has spoken about it publicly, has described the relationship with a kind of rueful honesty that is more revealing than any headline. She has said in various interviews over the years that Danny is her best friend, that she loves him, that the marriage as a formal structure stopped working, but that whatever the two of them are to each other never fully ended. Listen to that closely, because a woman saying her marriage stopped working while simultaneously saying the love never ended is not describing a happy outcome. She is describing a particular kind of grief that has no clean resolution. What went wrong? That is the question that hangs over all of it, and it deserves more than a shrug or a vague reference to the pressures of Hollywood life. Some biographers and observers have pointed to the imbalances that fame creates in even the most loving partnerships. When one person is constantly surrounded by adoration, when the world outside the marriage is perpetually telling you are extraordinary, that you are wanted, that you are desired, it becomes very difficult to return to the domestic scale of an ordinary evening at home. The contrast between public worship and private reality can be disorienting in ways that erode intimacy slowly, almost invisibly. Danny DeVito was, by all available accounts, a man who loved the energy of other people. He was social, gregarious, magnetic. He filled rooms. He threw parties. He was the person at the center of every gathering. That quality is part of what made him compelling on screen and beloved off it. But it is also a quality that does not always translate smoothly into the sustained quietness that long-term partnership requires. Rhea Perlman was, by contrast, more private, more inward, more likely to protect what was hers. 4 Emmy Awards worth of talent paired with a temperament that did not seek the spotlight in the same way her husband did. Those are not incompatible personalities, but they are personalities that require very deliberate tending. And fame in its most aggressive form discourages deliberate tending in favor of perpetual performance. There were also questions over the years about fidelity. It is important to be careful here because the documented record is thin and the subject is intimate. What can be said is that there were rumors, as there always are around any long marriage involving famous people. What can also be said is that Rhea Perlman has never publicly confirmed specific infidelities, and Danny DeVito has not either. What Rhea Perlman has confirmed in her own words across multiple interviews is that something in the marriage broke in a way that formal reconciliation could not fully repair. She has spoken about feeling alone in ways that are specific to being married to someone whose attention is perpetually claimed by the outside world. She has spoken with a quiet, almost reluctant honesty about the particular loneliness of being the person at home while the famous person is endlessly needed elsewhere. That is not an accusation. It is something more painful than an accusation. It is testimony. Look at this from her side for a moment. Rhea Perlman met Danny DeVito when he was nobody. She loved him into being, in the way that partners of rising stars often do, by believing in the person before the world did, by sustaining the household while the dream was still a long shot, by organizing her own ambitions around the shape of his. That is not a passive thing. That is an act of profound investment. And when the investment pays off, when the person you believed in becomes exactly what you knew they could be, there is a particular complexity in discovering that the famous version of the person you love is in some ways less available to you than the struggling version ever was. She had her own enormous success. That matters. Rhea Perlman was not simply a supporting character in Danny DeVito's story. She was a 4-time Emmy winner. She was Carla Tortelli for 11 seasons of one of the most beloved television programs in American history. She built a career that any actor would be proud to claim. But in the public imagination, in the shorthand of the culture, she was often positioned as his wife first, as part of the couple, as the woman beside the recognizable man. That is a quiet diminishment that accumulates over decades in ways that are hard to quantify and impossible to fully reverse. Their children, Lucy, Grace, and Jake, have each carved out their own paths in the entertainment industry, carrying forward a legacy that is complicated in the ways all inherited fame is complicated. They grew up watching two people love each other through separations and reconciliations and the constant managed performance of a marriage that the public had decided to treat as a symbol. What is it like to grow up as the child of that symbol? To know that your parents' relationship is not just their relationship, but a public narrative that millions of people have emotional ownership of. To watch your parents separate and then be asked to participate in the careful public maintenance of the story. These are not rhetorical questions. They are the real downstream cost of a certain kind of fame. The children of Hollywood marriages do not just inherit the money and the connections, they inherit the mythology. And mythology is a heavy thing to carry. The years after the second separation in 2017 were quieter, professionally and personally. Danny DeVito continued to work. His role as Frank Reynolds on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia gave him a new generation of fans, and arguably his most anarchic and liberating performance. The show's willingness to make Frank genuinely, unapologetically awful seemed to free something in him. He was no longer playing the underdog reaching for dignity. He was playing the id with no breaks, and he was magnificent at it. But off-screen, the personal landscape had settled into something that defied easy categorization. He and Rhea were not together in the formal sense. They were not divorced. They were something the English language does not have a precise word for. Two people bound by decades and children and shared history and genuine love, who had nonetheless concluded that the structure of marriage was not serving either of them. He gave interviews in which he spoke about her with unmistakable warmth. She gave interviews in which she spoke about him with unmistakable warmth. And yet they lived separately, and yet the marriage remained legally intact without functioning as a marriage. This is not a love story with a clean ending. It is a love story with an honest one. Here is what finally clarified in the way that only age and honesty together can clarify things. When Danny DeVito, at 81, began speaking publicly about Rhea Perlman as the love of his life, not a love, not a great love, but the love, it landed differently than it might have coming from a younger man. Because at 81, you are not performing. The audience for performance is diminishing. The incentive to maintain a flattering story about yourself is less compelling than it once was. What you say at 81 about the person you lost, or nearly lost, or cannot categorize, is as close to the truth as you are probably going to get. And what he said was unambiguous. According to multiple interviews and public statements made in recent years, Danny DeVito has described Rhea Perlman in terms that admit something he perhaps spent decades not fully admitting, that no one else compared. That the thing they had, in all its brokenness and beauty and repetitive rupture, was singular. That whatever failures the marriage accumulated, whatever damage was done in either direction, whatever loneliness she carried that he may not have seen, the love underneath it was real and unrepeatable. That is a profound thing to say. It is also, depending on how you hear it, a heartbreaking one. Because here is the tension that sits at the center of this entire story. And it is worth naming directly. Saying that someone was the love of your life is not the same as saying you loved them well. Saying the relationship was singular is not the same as saying you protected it. Feeling in your 80s that no one ever reached you the way she did is true and important, and perhaps some comfort to both of them. But it does not undo the separations. It does not retroactively fill the quiet years when she felt alone. It does not restore the decades during which the marriage was technically intact but functionally fractured. Love and harm are not opposites. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that long relationships eventually force into the open. A person can love someone completely and still fail them in consistent structural ways. A person can be the love of someone's life and still spend significant portions of that life feeling invisible inside the relationship. Rhea Perlman has earned the right to her own ambivalence about what Danny DeVito's declaration means. She has lived the whole story, not just the ending. What does Rhea Perlman feel receiving that declaration at this stage of their lives? She has not said, at least not fully. What she has said, in various contexts, is that she still loves him, that she considers him family, that their bond is not something that a separation or even a divorce filing could fully dissolve. She filed for divorce in 2023 after more than 6 years in the ambiguous state of separated but not divorced. It was, by all available accounts, a quiet legal step that changed the formal structure of their relationship without dramatically altering the emotional reality of it. They continued to be seen together. They continued to speak about each other with warmth. She did not give a dramatic statement. She did not offer a competing narrative. She took the legal step and continued being Rhea Perlman, private, self-possessed, carrying whatever she carries with the particular dignity of a woman who has spent her life being underestimated by people who did not look closely enough. The price that Rhea Perlman paid for being the love of Danny DeVito's life was not the price of poverty or obscurity or erasure. She was too talented and too determined for any of that. The price she paid was more intimate and in some ways more costly. She spent her life being genuinely loved by a man who was also genuinely unable, for long stretches, to make that love feel stable. She paid the price of being needed and not always seen. The price of being the anchor for a man who was always, on some level, performing for a larger audience. The price of building something extraordinary with someone and then watching the something crack without ever fully understanding why, or without getting a clear enough answer to grieve it properly and move forward. And now, at the end of the story, the man is saying it plainly. She was the one. She always was the one. The cruelest and most tender thing about that admission is that she already knew it. She knew it the whole time. That was never the question. The question was always whether knowing it was enough. There is a version of this story that resolves cleanly. Two people who loved each other, struggled, separated, maintained a bond across the legal dissolution of their marriage, and arrived in their 80s at something that resembles peace. That version is not wrong. It may even be what both of them would choose to say. But there is another version, quieter and more honest, that lives in the spaces between the interviews. In the years of separation, in the 4 Emmy Awards that sometimes get mentioned as a footnote to his career rather than the center of her own. In the children who grew up watching a love story that was also a negotiation. In the woman who was the love of his life and who, for long and painful stretches, may have felt like the person least certain of that fact. Danny DeVito has built one of the most improbable careers in Hollywood history. A man who was told at every turn that he did not fit, not the right height, not the right face, not the right category, who found his way into the center of American culture through sheer force of will and talent and refusal. That story is genuinely remarkable and genuinely earned. But the woman who was there at the beginning, who loved him before the cameras did, who built a life and a family inside the force field of his ambition and his fame, her story is just as complicated and considerably less told. At 81, Danny DeVito says she is the only love of his life. The words have the weight of a man who has finally stopped performing long enough to say the true thing. What Rhea Perlman does with those words, whether they are comfort or consolation or simply too late in some ways that matter, is her private business. She has always been better than most at keeping what's hers close. But the image that stays, when all the interviews and separations and reconciliations and legal filings have been accounted for, is not the one from the red carpets or the Emmy ceremonies or the cheerful late-night appearances. The image that stays is quieter. It is two people in their 80s who cannot fully be together and cannot fully be without each other, who are bound by something that outlasted the structure meant to contain it. That is not a tragedy exactly. It is something more human than tragedy. It is a love story that refused to end neatly, lived by two people too real to pretend otherwise. Some loves are so total they survive everything they go through, even the damage, even the distance, even the years. The question that haunts it, the one worth sitting with long after the story ends, is whether surviving everything is the same as being whole. It isn't always. But sometimes, in the very last chapter, the honesty itself becomes a kind of arrival, a way of finally giving the person what they deserved from the beginning, even if the beginning was a long, long time ago.